Ukraine has reportedly driven the Russians back in Kharkiv Oblast. Is this a sign of more Ukrainian offensives to come? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So this is a really interesting story. Now, Ukraine claims to have reclaimed some territory north of Kharkiv Oblast, but in the process taking out what they say is almost an entire Russian regiment. That's thousands of soldiers. Now, the actual area is relatively small, just about 1,000 acres of forest in Kharkiv. But what's interesting about it is a couple of things. The first is that it is reportedly in the area where Russia staged its incursion in the north, pushing towards the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Now, the Russians seem to believe that they were going to push all the way into Kharkiv, but it just didn't materialize. The Ukrainians were able to stop them in part because the U.S. got a little more flexible with its policy about its weapons striking inside Russia. Now, what I think is most interesting is, again, you can see this is a relatively limited area that they've taken here. But what's I think is most interesting is, again, the fact that this is a small forested area. And before I break down the tactics that I think were used here, I want to mention that if you want to see some uncensored combat footage, including some of this fighting, you want to become a member over on combatvetnews.com. This is my version of Patreon, right? I make exclusive content for the Combat Vet News members twice a week, uncensored combat footage coming to us from the front line, some pretty intense stuff usually, and we just had a video drop today. We also had one of the Q&As drop for lieutenant tiers. So if you want to further support the channel, keep me independent, and get access to those videos, you want to click the link in the description or go to combatvetnews.com. Okay, so here's what I want to talk about as far as the tactics that we saw there. Now, again, let's see if I can pull up. I want to pull up a slightly different map here because I think there's going to be some value to a slightly different look on the map. So when we check out here, now we zoom in and you can see near Lipsy, this is the area itself where this fighting took place. Now you can see here, again, this is listed as contested, but the Ukrainians are reporting this as liberated. So again, I think it's more likely to say that this is considered rolled back. So here's what I think is noteworthy. You could see that this is actually not quite the great terrain they might think it is. With the fact that the Ukrainian forces and Russian forces were divided right along this narrow strip of forest means that there was potential that the Russians might actually end up surrounded. You notice what they don't have. They don't have the ability to retreat across this river here. They also have a very limited ability to retreat into this other forested area, reportedly where Russian forces held more terrain. And so what the situation you end up with is that I suspect the Ukrainians realized that a little too many Russians, apparently a whole regiment, had sort of boxed themselves into this forested zone. And again, based on sort of Russian tactics, it makes sense that if you want to hold this roadway here, it's going to be tough for Russia to do so because, right, you can see it's pretty open ground. And instead, they might have used this area as sort of cover. And this can be obviously a good thing, but just like in urban combat, when you bunch up a bunch of troops in one place, you create a bunch of risk, right? You've literally put all of your eggs in one basket. And the Ukrainians seem to have realized this. And I suspect they said, listen, we can not literally surround this area, but we can virtually surround it. And I think that's what they likely did, right? Deploying a large amount of drones and artillery basically to cut off this retreat, right? They can't swim across this river. That would be an absolute mess, right? You literally can't swim across a river in combat gear. We made an earlier video about the Navy SEALs who fell into an ocean in full battle rattle, and just the weight of all that gear dragged them down in reportedly less than a minute. So, and that's Navy SEALs, right? That's to say nothing of some Russians. So they can't retreat eastward. And if Ukraine deployed drones and artillery that, or possibly even deployable anti-personnel mines, they might find themselves cut off. And so all it would take is a Ukrainian squad to dig in this narrow, tiny little strip of forest right here Now, it'd be a lot. It's a tall order. They'd have to dig a position and just not let the Russians advance at any cost from either direction. But if they could do it for just like 12 hours, what you could have is a situation where Ukraine is able to advance and is able to push these Russians hard and force them to either retreat into waiting mines or cluster munitions, force them to retreat into a riverbank where they're not going to be able to cross and will still be trapped in the open, or just simply surrender, right? And so I think that might have been the Ukrainian strategy here. They might have just noticed the Russians were vulnerable and made this push. And this is sort of why I think there's some value in this, right? Now, obviously, let's ground ourselves in reality here, guys. The Russian advances have been continuing, right? This is us working backwards through time. And you can see there's been a steady creep of Russian forces as they've made these advances. And so a small Ukrainian pushback isn't that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. But what it does show is that Ukraine increasingly is willing to say, hey, when there are localized opportunities and asymmetries where we think offensive operations will kill a lot more Russians than we'll lose, we are now pivoting towards being willing to undertake them. And I think this is pretty significant. It says that the Ukrainians are not permanently stuck on the back foot. It keeps the Russians more honest about building defenses. Because remember, if the Ukrainians demonstrate that they're willing to punch and even just little bloody noses like this, it's going to tell every other Russian at the front line who makes a fresh advance to say, hey, don't get lazy, dig in. The Ukrainians will sometimes push back. And I think that's what probably happened here. The Russians got a little sloppy. The Ukrainians said, hey, we can really exploit this to our advantage and take out a lot of Russians. And that's exactly what happened. And so I think this sort of counterpuncher strategy can be quite effective for Ukrainian forces. Again, very limited sort of maneuvers can prove very effective even when the larger battlefield is so attritional. Again, I think this is probably a sign of things to come, but more than that, it more like proves it's the exception that proves the rule, that the Ukrainians are willing to go on offense when they think they can really exterminate a lot more Russians than they lose. Because again, they have to maintain this very high attritional advantage over Russia, something in the ballpark of 3-1. And there's a lot of evidence that it's working. But again, they've got to do so in a way that's tactically sound. And that means in most places, letting the Russians be the one who come out of their trench and drive. Anyway, that's all I had. Huge thank you to our Colonel tier members like James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Ellen Knutson, Bastian Himmerling, Brian Kelly, Dale McCombs, James Ola, Henley Roosier, and all the Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do this without you guys. See you in the next one. Cheers.